My name is Roger Fiedler, and I'll be the MC for our session today. I'm the Communications Director at McCurl International, which administers the REL Pacific program on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. I'm being supported behind the scenes by several of my colleagues who work on REL Pacific, including Kirsten Miller, our Communications Manager, who you might see helping answer questions in the chat room. Today's session is the second of 3 webinars that we have planned for this particular topic. So please keep an eye out for information coming up soon about webinar 3, which we'll be scheduling for a little bit later this summer or early fall. I'll tell you more about the REL program and today's topic in particular in just a minute, but first I have just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders about today's session. First off, we're asking all participants to please leave your microphones muted leave your microphones and phone lines muted to avoid any feedback and to help us keep our audio clear for our presenters. If you do have a question or comment during the session itself, please feel free to type it into the chat box. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat throughout the session, and we'll be pausing from time to time to answer questions as they come up. We'll also take some time at the end of the session for one more opportunity for questions as they come in. You can give the chat box a try right now by posting hello, letting us know where you're joining us from today. We also have closed captions available from the toolbar within Zoom if you'd like to turn those on. And our program today is scheduled to last for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how many questions that we get along the way and the discussion those questions prompt. Please note that we are recording the webinar today, and we'll be sending all registrants a copy of both the slide deck and a link to the recording after the session concludes. So keep an eye out in the next few days for emails from relpacific@mccurl.org. We'll also include a link to a survey in those emails where you can give us some feedback on how today's session went. Please do take some time to complete that very brief survey, as it will help us plan for future events. We are pleased to have 3 content experts joining us today to present insights on assessment systems that support social-emotional learning, equity, and student well-being. Katie Buckley will be joining us. She is a Senior Managing Director at Teach for America, where she oversees research and evaluation related to social-emotional development, and she has deep expertise in measurement, impact, and strategies related to SEL and positive school environments. Hello, Katie. And Christopher Brandt is an associate at the Center for Assessment, where he focuses on federal accountability, balanced assessment systems, and evaluation of assessment programs. He is a What Works Clearinghouse certified reviewer, and he has led numerous impact studies for the U.S. Department of Education, state education agencies, and foundations. Hello, Chris. And also with us today is Fern Yoshida, who is an education specialist at the Hawaii Department of Education. And as a public school educator, she has led various state programs and initiatives, and currently works on fostering the advancement of social and emotional learning and trauma-informed practices in schools. And hello, Fern. I'll turn things over to Katie, Chris, and Fern in just a moment, but I first want to let you know a little bit about the REL program, which is hosting today's webinar. So if you're not familiar with REL Pacific or the REL programs in general, the regional educational laboratories are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And these 10 RELs located across the country and in the Pacific region collaborate with their local school districts, state departments of education, policymakers, and other education stakeholders to help them put research into action. So in each of their assigned regions, the REL programs and associated staff conduct applied research, and they provide training to educators and system leaders, all with a mission of supporting a more evidence-based education system and using research in ways that really improve outcomes for students. Now, today's webinar is sponsored by the REL Pacific region. The REL Pacific serves educators and school systems located across the state of Hawaii, the U.S. territories of American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the island nations of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. Now, within this region, the REL Pacific focuses its partnership work on 5 high priority areas, and those are college and career readiness and success, professional learning, language and literacy, social and emotional learning, and data use and readiness. Now, several of these topic areas combine and lead us to today's webinar. We will be exploring and discussing balanced systems of assessment that support equitable learning opportunities and child well-being. And while we know that our topic is of high interest to educators in the Pacific region, we know it's also of high interest across the mainland. And we have participants today joining us from all across the US in a variety of education systems. So our primary learning objectives for today's session will be learning how a holistic assessment system can help support more equitable learning environments and improve students' academic outcomes and social emotional learning. And we'll understand a little bit more how to integrate these assessments into school systems, and also how to integrate specific assessment practices into school and classroom-based instruction. Taking a quick look at our agenda for the session, Katie will be leading things off with a discussion about how to situate SEL in balanced assessment systems. Chris will follow with a perspective of how holistic systems of assessment can support whole child development. And Fern will provide us with evidence-based practices to support SEL assessment within a multi-tiered system of support. Now, please keep in mind, as I mentioned before, that if you do have a question or comment during the session, please use the chat feature and we'll respond to your questions as they come up, and then take a little bit of time at the end also for final questions. And with that, I will turn things over to our first presenter, Katie Buckley. So Katie, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for having me. As Roger noted, my name is Katie Buckley. I am the Senior Managing Director of Social-Emotional Learning at Teach for America. I'm thrilled to be here with you all, and I want to welcome everyone and say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know folks are from a variety of time zones, so I appreciate you joining. At Teach for America, I oversee our research and measurement and ensure that it is feeding directly back into our work with our national programming and our regional programming to ultimately positively impact our core members and our students. And so drawing on some of that work and some of work from my prior experiences, I'm going to talk a little bit about situating social emotional learning and balance assessment systems. I'm going to provide a really high-level overview to really touch upon principles and share some resources that might be relevant given your context and needs. But my colleagues Fern and Chris will dive a lot deeper, and happy to address any questions you might have. All right. I want to start with just a broad definition of social emotional learning. I assume most of you have seen this one or something similar, but I find it's often helpful to orient to a common definition. And there's a couple of things I want to point out. This definition in particular is from Castle, and they define SEL as a process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. And I want to highlight two things about this, this definition. The first is that Castle actually updated their definition last year, recognizing that it's really important to not just focus on individual social emotional development, but to understand the ways in which these competencies are crucial for collective well-being, for equity in communities and in schools. Rob Jagers, who is their VP of research, coined the term transformative SEL, which really is about ensuring that when we are bringing SEL into the school, we are doing so in a way to lift up all students and to further equitable outcomes in that school, and ultimately give students and adults the skills and awareness they need to then go into their communities to really fight for justice and equity. The other thing that I want to note here that's applicable for measurement is that we really think about SEL as a process. And it's not necessarily a linear process, right? When we think about academic achievement, we often see sort of an upward trajectory as students acquire more skills and more knowledge. The same is not necessarily true of social emotional competencies. And in fact, when we measure SEL, we often find dips from fall to spring or from year to year. And so it's really important to keep that context in mind as we start to implement SEL measurement. I want to turn your attention to this 2x2 matrix, where we really kind of can start to categorize SEL competencies along the intrapersonal related to within and the interpersonal related to others, and around sets of awareness and mindsets, and then skills and behaviors. And we find this is really helpful to start to categorize SEL competencies in this way because there are dozens and dozens of competencies we could focus on. And so it's really important to start to understand what those competencies are and how they might fit with your own priorities, your context, your needs. As I alluded to before with the definition of SEL, it's not just about impacting individual well-being, but about impacting collective well-being. We have decades of research that have shown the importance of SEL for academic achievement, for career success, for health and well-being. But in the last decade or so, and particularly in the last year, we've really started focusing on the impact of SEL for interrogating individual bias, for pursuing equity and anti-racism, and for creating inclusive communities. At TFA, when we talk about the importance of SEL, we talk about it as something that fosters equity-minded skills, dispositions, and orientations so that individuals can achieve greater success in school and life, as well as greater impact in addressing inequities and systemic racism in their communities. And it's not, when we talk about SEL, it's also not just about focusing on students, right? We really, as a field, have started really talking and pushing for this focus on the adults in the school, along with the learning environment. And so this quote from Chris Cipriano and Mark Brackett, they are from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and they do a lot of work in thinking about adult SEL and the importance of adult SEL, not only for adults' own well-being, but for students' well-being. And so here they talk about the importance of SEL for adult health and well-being, which is certainly one outcome. We also see that when we focus our professional development and teacher programming on adult SEL, that there's less stress and less burnout among our teachers. And importantly, that our teachers are able to model really healthy SEL development. We often say in the SEL field that SEL is both taught and caught, by which I mean we need to explicitly teach these mindsets and behaviors, but we also really need to be able to model it and coach our students in their own development so that they can start to internalize it and transfer these skills across contexts. And we also know from the science of learning and development, a lot of the work, excuse me, from Dave Pinescu and Camille Farrington, who you see quoted here, that it's not just about SEL development. We have to pay a lot of attention to the environments that kids are in and the experiences we're providing for them. And that without this, SEL simply becomes an add-on and it's not having the impact that we intend. So Camille Farrington and others have developed the BELLY network. It's Building Equitable Learning Environments, where they really provide a ton of resources and frameworks in helping districts, schools, states think about what it means to create equitable opportunities to learn, and really focusing on both the student experiences, right? That students are experiencing intellectually rigorous learning environments, that they're experiencing not just physical, but psychological safety, that they're engaged in relevant and meaningful work that they can see themselves represented in, that there's an acknowledgement of various values and practices and perspectives across culture and ethnicity, that students are feeling seen, respected, and cared for, and that they have opportunities to set and meet goals and to learn and recover from mistakes, right? And this last one, we can really clearly see growth mindset right in that. If we're telling our kids, hey, it's really important to have a growth mindset, but if you fail at this assignment, there's going to be consequences. Well, we're giving them mixed messages. And so creating an environment in which all students feel safe in failing and understand the learning experience in that is crucial to these other outcomes that we know are part of students thriving and developing and becoming whole people. Developing intellectual curiosity, having a sense of agency, having an integrated identity, understanding others' cultures and having a greater sense of cultural awareness and cultural competency, and developing empathy and connection with others. All of these are crucial to ultimately developing the whole child and focusing on SEL and implementing it in a balanced assessment system. So in my work with schools and districts, often the first question I get asked is, all right, tell me what to measure and how. And I always say to folks that is the wrong question to ask at this stage. We've really got to step back and say, what is your vision? What is your vision for student success? What is your portrait of a graduate? What is your vision for whole child development? What are your values? What are your needs? What are your stakeholders saying is important to them? And so when we think about this sort of balanced assessment system, we have to think about these sort of 4 different steps that I think are crucial to ultimately ensuring we are creating an equitable approach to SEL measurement. First, setting this vision, thinking about what the stakeholders, the teachers, the students, the parents, the community members are saying that they want, that they need. We can then look at prioritizing a framework based on that vision or a set of competencies. A framework in particular can bring greater coherence and sustainability to the work. It really allows folks to internalize it, to really integrate it into their practice. And also, it really allows us to have a common language around SEL. We often say in SEL, there's the jingle jangle fallacy. We have one term that means multiple things and multiple terms that mean one thing. And this can cause a lot of confusion around the language that we're using. And so having a framework or set of priorities that is clearly tied to one's values, I've seen really as sort of crucial to the work of doing this. When I go into schools and I see them talking with students and giving feedback to students couched in their values, couched in the things that they're prioritizing, I know that school has really internalized their focus on SEL. Next, when we start to think about assessment, we first have to think about why we want to assess. We want to make sure our measure is validated for the intended use case, right? We want to ensure that our measure is actually measuring the thing that we want to assess. And we want to make sure that we are aligning our measurement to the types of things we want to assess, by which I mean, when we think about, for example, interpersonal mindsets and behaviors, right? We know that those are things that that are internally held and are not necessarily externally observable. So we can't have a teacher report of student SEL if the things that we want to prioritize are things like social awareness and self-efficacy and growth mindset. And so as we think about, in general, the assessments that are currently being used, primarily we see a lot of student surveys. These are often administered in 4th through 12th grade, where we think students have sort of the right level of reading knowledge to be able to answer the question, the right level of metacognition to be able to answer the question. So there are student surveys, there are teacher surveys of students, externally observable skills, and there are also direct reports as well, usually performance-based tasks that we can ask of little kiddos in particular. And then we want to think about what are those evidence-based strategies and programs that we want to implement that are really driven by the data, driven by what the data is saying, we need to work on, driven by our goals, driven by our priorities. And I want to emphasize a couple of things here. This isn't just about implementing a standalone curriculum or program, right? This has to be fully integrated into the work of the school. If you have a SEL curriculum and you're really focusing on SEL, but you have discipline policies that are really inequitable and are really about student compliance, you're basically giving the student mixed messages. And so it's really important that the programs are implemented into all of the work of the school. Another thing that I want to highlight here is that it's not just about programs or curricula, or curriculum. In fact, a lot of the schools that I've seen that are doing this really well, they haven't implemented a particular program. It's really about the language, the culture, the climate, a way of being among the teachers, these what we call teacher moves, teacher strategies, the way they talk to students, the way they provide feedback. And then the last thing I want to emphasize here is it's not just about SEL skills for students, right? This goes back to what we were saying before. We want to ensure we have PD programs and PD tools for our adults in the school as well to continually reflect and to develop their own skills. And of course, through all of these, we really want to make sure and we really want to continuously focus on whether our approach to measurement, to implementation is equitable. And so as we do this, I offer a few questions to consider. These are questions that I often provide to the folks that I'm working with as they seek to do this work. I think the sort of first question I say is the measure that you're choosing, is it actually assessing the things you care about? And has it been validated for your intended use? Right? Are you taking a formative assessment and trying to use it for summative purposes? In which case, are we really getting the validate? Are we really having a measure that's validated for our intended use? Are we focusing on just student SEL, or are we focusing on adult SEL and learning opportunities and learning environments? Are we collecting data on multiple aspects of SEL in order to triangulate and understand where our strengths are and where our needs are. To what degree are we capturing unbiased perspectives from all student populations, right? So to what degree is stereotype threat or reference bias creeping into how students are responding if we're using a student-based survey? The next one is really important. Are the tasks that we're including, are the questions we're including culturally representative and asset-based? And so I want to just unpack this a little bit. A lot of the measures that we've looked at and that were initially developed were really focusing on lifting up or identifying strengths of a white middle-class norm. And we want to make sure we are asking questions in which all of the cultures of our school, of our community are being represented, and we're able to understand and we're able to get comparable data from the surveys. And when I say asset-based, what I mean here is that we are seeking to lift up the strengths of all students and identify needs in which to further support students, as opposed to a diagnostic, for example, like a mental health survey where we're really just trying to identify issues or problem behaviors. Who do you invite to join the data conversations? Are you bringing a diverse set of perspectives to interpreting and acting on the data? Another one that I think is really important is investigating the implicit and explicit biases that might be skewing the interpretation of the data. And then are we ensuring equitable access to the supports and resources? This was a big one last year with hybrid and remote learning. Are all students able to access the resources and the supports that you're implementing as a result of what the data is telling you? How might leadership or staff be unintentionally using the data to evaluate students? And so if we had more time, we could dig into all of the ways in which student surveys are incredibly corruptible. Oftentimes when I would talk with leaders, school leaders or district leaders, and they said, how do we raise our students' scores on these SEL surveys? And I would say, well, you just tell them to answer a 5 on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. And I wasn't saying that, it wasn't being glib. It is actually, it's a survey. It's not a test of academic achievement. And so as soon as students or teachers know or think that this test is being used to this survey is being used to evaluate them, they're just going to start to answer how they think others expect them to answer, right? And then it loses its value. And now do you have and finally, and I think most importantly, do you have a system set up to continually monitor the use of measures and ensure they are being used to further equitable conditions? Are you continuously going back and saying, are we still doing right by our students? Are we still supporting all of our students equitably? Or are we shifting into a blame the student mentality with this data? And if we are, how do we readjust? Finally, I want to leave you with a set of resources to explore as you seek to do this work. This first resource, actually, the compendium of resources for integrating SEL into the work of districts, this actually contains a much broader list of lots of resources that are out there. This compendium is sort of, it breaks down the list to think about sort of the framework I offered before, setting a vision, what resources can you use to do that, choosing a framework, and what resources can you use to move that forward. The next resource or framework for integrating SEL into the classroom by transforming education, I think this it's a great framework my colleagues at my prior job developed, and really gets into what does this look like in practice in the classroom. Transformative social-emotional learning, I think this is a key article to read. This is by Rob Jagers and co-authors, in which he's really putting forth a new conception of SEL that is deeply rooted in equity and lifting up strengths of all student cultures. Explore frameworks and terms. This was developed by Stephanie Jones and colleagues, which is really an attempt to address that jingle jangle fallacy. So it looks at multiple terms and multiple frameworks and shows you the ways in which they align or the ways in which they might be different to help you start to understand what framework might be best for you. And finally, choosing and using SEL measures is something I co-wrote with my co-authors from RAND and CASEL, and it's used to supplement the CASEL SEL assessment guide. And really it is about just providing guidance on how to choose the measures and then how to integrate it into your work. So I want to thank you all. I will pause for any questions that you might have now or in the chat. And so I'll turn it over to Roger.
Thank you, Katie. And again, if you have questions for Katie, please jump into the chat and post them. And Katie, I did have one question, maybe while people are thinking about their own question to put into the chat. You had mentioned the importance of when a school or district is beginning to think about assessments, that they first start with the vision of what they want to accomplish. Have you seen good models, good practices for how a school or district begins that conversation with their school community? How do they initiate those conversations with stakeholders?
Yeah, and in fact, there is a great resource. Minnesota has done some great work on this, and they've created just that. Like, how did they go about doing this? How did they start with bringing in their stakeholders and really making sure that they are listening and hearing from their parents, their teachers, their students, their community members to say, what is it that matters? And this step, I would say, is just so crucial, because if you run and implement SEL without first getting everyone to feel like they've had input and they have buy-in, then it's not going to have the intended effect. At the end of the day, you need to have parent-teacher partnerships, community partnerships, to really make sure this is integrated into the work and that everyone is bought in this vision together.
Thank you. So again, for our audience, if you think of a question later that you wanted to ask, please still do go ahead and post in the chat, because we'll come back around at the end to catch up on any of the questions that we've missed, to come back to Katie. But in the meantime, we will proceed on with Chris Brandt, and Chris, we'll let you get started with your section.
All right, great. Thank you, Roger. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Brandt. I'm an associate at the Center for Assessment. My presentation today focuses on holistic systems of assessment. So I'll start by defining what they are, I'll describe why we need them, and then I'll conclude by offering some high-level principles that a district or state can use to develop and apply those types of systems. Next slide, please. So many of you on this call, I imagine you've likely experienced firsthand the school-related challenges associated with COVID-19. And I listed 3 of the more salient challenges here for schools. And that included, number 1, a lack of access to learning resources. So in working with districts, we found that a lot of districts didn't have, or a lot of students didn't have access to reliable internet, didn't have access to a computer, high quality learning resources, or even space to work. The second was lack of access to social and emotional learning supports. And I want to highlight a recent survey of California teachers that found that almost 70% reported a substantial number of their students were in danger of suffering long-term mental health issues. And then the third is a lack of trustworthy data. So local agencies, especially larger districts and states, a lot of them struggled to understand the extent of the gaps in resources in SEL services because they didn't have reliable access to data on those issues. And so in total, those challenges had really a disproportional effect on our most vulnerable students and subgroups. Next slide. So those challenges raised some really important questions about how school quality is measured. Under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, as many of you know, states have now more flexibility in how they choose to hold schools accountable. So ESSA expands how school quality can be defined and measured. ESSA also allows states more flexibility in how they provide support to lowest performing schools. But despite those additional flexibilities, student test results still remain the primary source of information that is used to evaluate school quality and to hold schools accountable. And this is because the law requires that states give, quote, much greater weight to achievement in the aggregate compared to other school quality measures. So in summary, although the state's definitions of school quality have expanded since ESSA, those definitions are still narrowly focused on academic achievement oftentimes. And if states and districts only seek to comply with federal law, then really they're missing out on some key system inputs and outputs that they need to be measuring, which we're now hearing are now called opportunity to learn indicators. And those opportunity to learn indicators represent what really are the essential resources and services that ultimately are going to influence students' readiness to learn. Next slide. So what are the implications for state and local agencies? Well, first, system inputs do matter and we should measure them. Test scores alone are insufficient measures of school quality. They're definitely necessary, and I don't think anybody would argue that they're not, but they're insufficient when you are trying to measure the quality of the school. Second, school quality requires a broad range of indicators, not just indicators that are focused on achievement. And by using this broad range of indicators, education agencies, districts, states, they can then start to create a holistic picture of school quality and inform more equitable school support. Next slide. Okay, so what is a holistic assessment system? Well, a lot of state and districts have begun to develop these systems, and they are systems that essentially collect information to monitor and support whole child development. So this idea of a holistic assessment system expands the notion of success beyond academics, and it incorporates measures of students' social, emotional, academic, behavioral, and physical well-being in addition to their academic performance. Education agencies are using these systems in at least two ways. So the first way is to support skills and abilities that we know have to be in place before academic learning can happen. So those skills include things like 21st century skills. Oftentimes are these types of skills like collaboration, self-regulation, self-management, as well as many of the social and emotional well-being indicators that Katie mentioned. Second, they're using these holistic systems to create more equitable learning experiences, especially for our most vulnerable students. So what can be really impactful with these systems is that they can help you to measure disparities in the resources in the system, the resources and the inputs, sorry, that are necessary for student success in school. So examples of those resources would be high quality curriculum, access to effective teachers, access to technology and the internet, even things like who may or may not have access to nutritional meals. When you collect this data, then you have the opportunity to look at disparities from school to school, from student subgroup to student subgroup, and who has these resources and has access to them and who doesn't. And then you can start allocating resources in a more planful way. Next slide. So this is an example of a holistic school quality framework. This was developed by Jack Schneider and a team of researchers in collaboration with a small school district in Massachusetts. In developing this framework, Schneider and his team started by asking, what is it that stakeholders, including educators, parents, and the public, what is it that they care about? And so they conducted a review of national polls, a review of research, they surveyed district personnel, and they interviewed city residents, and they focused both on inputs and on outcomes. And they found that, well, actually, before I want to talk about what they found, the inputs that they found were most likely to produce the positive outcomes are there on the left. You can see teachers in the teaching environment, school culture and resources, and then some indicators under those larger domains that they found were really important. On the right were outcomes that emerged as being very important. And those outcomes involved or encompassed academic learning, but also character and well-being. So using that framework, the district then identified a set of measures to evaluate all of those key domains that you see here, the inputs on the left and the outputs on the right. And perhaps surprisingly, much of the data was already collected by the state. And so they didn't have to collect a lot of additional data. What they did do was they developed teacher and student surveys to capture a few of these constructs that you see that they weren't currently collecting. So that's just an example. Next slide. This slide talks about the specific set of indicators that a district can use in order to develop a holistic assessment system. This is a report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. It was released, I think, in 2018, and it presents recommendations for indicators and measures that can help a district or a state more holistically identify these systemic inequities and focus on whole child development. So if you haven't seen this report and you're thinking about developing a more holistic assessment system, I highly encourage that you look at this. It's a really helpful resource, both for states and districts. Next slide. So now I'm going to shift gears. I want to talk a little bit about how a district might go about developing a holistic system of assessment. But before I do that, I want to share a quote from Ted Coladarsi. Ted was a professor of educational psychology at the University of Maine. He wrote extensively on issues related to assessment in rural education. And he said, and we often share this quote, he said, a collection of assessments does not entail a system any more than a pile of bricks constitutes a house. And I think that's just so, this visual is so helpful in thinking about systems of assessment and how often, I'm sure many of you who are working in schools and districts know this firsthand, that we collect all sorts of data, but that data oftentimes isn't connected in an organized way to help us really understand what's working and what's not working, and whether or not we're moving toward our goals. So, so that's what this holistic system is trying to do. And next slide. And again, I listed just 4 very high level but key principles for developing and using holistic systems of assessment. Admittedly, today I'm just scratching the surface, but hopefully this provides a helpful starting point for those of you who are interested in developing these. Broadly speaking, the principles begin with establishing a vision, planning for an implementation, creating the measurement infrastructure, and evaluating and improving. Oh, you're already on the next slide. Okay, great. So the first step is establishing the vision. And so many districts have begun to do this by developing what's called a graduate portrait, or a portrait of a graduate. And that portrait of a graduate represents the 21st century skills that a community wants to make sure that students have in order to be college, career, and life ready. So creating a vision like this can ensure that the district and school focuses on the knowledge, skills, mindsets, and habits that are really important and extend beyond just academic or test performance. Next slide. So step 2 is to plan for implementation. And this is where things can get a little muddy. And it gets a little muddy in terms of how to do it, but also in terms of the language that we tend to use. So a lot of people are, some of you might be familiar with the term theory of action. People use that term, theory of action. I've also heard theories of improvement, logic models, driver diagrams. All of these terms tend to be used interchangeably because their definitions overlap. And the difference in some of those terms are really a matter of nuance. They even depend on sometimes on which field you were trained in. So for that reason, I just want to briefly distinguish between how we define theory of action, logic model, and implementation plan. You can think of these 3 concepts as running along a continuum from less to more detailed. So usually it starts with the theory of action. The theory of action is what a district puts together to cast a wide view of the program and start specifying relationships between improvement strategies and outputs and outcomes. The logic model then begins to operationalize that theory of action by describing, okay, what is supposed to happen first, second, third, and so on in order to achieve these goals that we have. So it's it specifies the resources that a district would need, the activities like professional development and other activities that they would need to put in place in order to make their goals happen. That should produce some set of outcomes, which in turn should produce some short, mid, and long-term outcomes for students. So once you have that in place, then you can start thinking about an implementation plan, which really lays that plan out and talks specifically about the people and the departments and the roles and responsibilities that each person within those departments has in terms of implementation. And then you can begin to assign and tasks, develop timelines, and assign ownership to different tasks. Next slide. So with this implementation plan, actually, let me back up. So this is an example of a high-level theory of action. This just very highly illustrates how a state can support school improvement. So this is a state's theory of action that we helped the state develop for school improvement. If you wanted to take this and move it to a logic model, you could take each one of these components and just sort of blow it out. So as an example, state longitudinal data system, you see that at the bottom on the left-hand side of the screen under resources and inputs, you see the state longitudinal data system is listed there. That data system is designed to produce, it collects a bunch of data, and then that data is reported to districts, and districts are supposed to use that data to inform resources, training, and guidance, which then in turn would lead to improvements in curriculum, instruction and assessment, deeper learning, and long-term outcomes. In order to really measure this, we need to know, what do those data reports look like? So for example, what would a district, a school, and teachers need in terms of data reports to help them drive their instruction, to drive strategic planning, and so forth? What a district needs is very, very different, and at a very much higher grain size than what a teacher would need. And then using that data, what would we expect the resources, training, and guidance would be? So you can see how each of these components needs to be further broken down in a logic model and before it can be measured. Next slide. Once it's broken down, you can then start tying indicators and measures to monitor that theory of action. And the measurement infrastructure is really essential for allowing a district to examine what's working, to examine the relationship across the causal chain, for whom things are working, and under what conditions the system is working. So as an example, in one of our studies, we found that professional development was working well for experienced teachers, but not for the beginning teachers, that they needed something qualitatively different. And being able to attach measures to and indicators to that theory of action allowed us to identify where that gap was and the differences, the variation between more and less experienced teachers that was occurring, so that then we could go back and say, okay, something needs to change with this training. Otherwise, our beginning teachers are not going to be helped by this professional development. Next slide. This is just, I took the framework that I presented earlier from Jack Schneider and just attach some measures to it. So you can see how, if you wanted to clearly measure inputs, outputs, and outcomes, you can start with a framework like this and then start thinking about, okay, what are the types of data that would enable us to collect information on school culture, on resources, on character and well-being, and so forth. Next slide. And then finally, the last step is to evaluate and improve. And I talked a lot about this already with the infrastructure, the measurement infrastructure. But the one thing that is really important to remember is it's very helpful to start small, to test your theory first within maybe a small number of schools or even one school, and then slowly expand as you learn more about what works for whom and under what conditions. Also remember that this process is very iterative. So expect to revisit your theory of action and your logic model over and over again as you test these various interventions and collect information about how they work in schools. This is not, even though we put this in a linear process, this process is not linear in any way, shape, or form. It's very, very iterative, and in practice, you'll find that you're constantly going back and forth, and it's the data that allows you to see where the changes are needed. Last slide. That's funny. Okay, so I have one more slide that I actually hid, and so I'll just talk about it. One of the things that Katie talked about around social and emotional learning was this idea about how, we have some robust measures of social and emotional learning now, which are really key for developing holistic assessment systems. But what we still lack is an understanding about how social and emotional learning skills develop over time. The process is not linear like an academic assessment. So you can't look, it's very, very difficult for most SEL skills to look over time and say, well, we should see growth in this measure over time. Because somebody who might report self-efficacy in one domain or in one context may feel like, may report something completely different in a different context or when they're surrounded with different people. So we still have a lot to learn about how cognition, psychology, and culture interactively affect learning and development, and how to develop these and use these measures of social and emotional learning to support students' holistic growth.
Thank you, Chris. And for those of you listening in, if you have a question for Chris, please post it in the chat. Chris, in hearing you talk about the types of systems that are being developed, it sounds like some of them might be more along the lines of an annual, a summative style test to allow year-to-year comparisons, although with the limitations that you just talked about. Are you also seeing some movement on creation of more informal, formative assessments that schools or teachers can use to make those in-the-moment iterations to help with a particular school initiative? Yeah,
Roger, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because it was something I meant to touch on and I didn't. A lot of districts are now using the networked improvement community approach, which is exactly what you described. It's developing, essentially it's developing a logic model and then taking that logic model and creating what are called practical measures. So these are measures that are easy to use, are easy for teachers to use, easy to administer to students to collect, and they provide very frequent information and very sensitive information that's close to the student. And using that, then teachers and schools can go through this cycle that I described. It's a plan, do, study, act cycle. Those cycles happen very quickly. And so for the sake of time, I'll just point people to the Carnegie Foundation, which has developed a number of really helpful resources on how to implement networked improvement communities and conduct this a very fast process of planning, doing, studying, and acting using, very sensitive, rapid type data and measures.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Fern, let's turn to you now to give us some insight on what the state of Hawaii is doing, so we can get the presentation look. There we go. And Fern, I'll turn it over to you.
Aloha everyone. Mahalo for having us here and sharing this space together. So I am from the Hawaii Department of Education, the Office of Student Support Services. And I'm going to share a little bit with you of how we are implementing social-emotional learning assessments within the department. And we are by no means experts in any way, but more practitioners and growing together. So this is a makeup or the demographics of the Hawaii Department of Education. We have approximately 170,000 school students at this time. It's 10,000 less than what it typically was prior to the pandemic, likely because many of our students are learning remotely or through homeschool and whatnot. So we've lost about 10,000 since the pandemic. But this gives you an idea of what our makeup is. We have 294 public and charter schools with approximately 13,000 teachers on board. The ethnic makeup is on that pie that you see in front of you, with the majority of our students being in the vicinity of Asian and Pacific Islander heritage. We have 48.19% of low socioeconomic status students, 9.79 EL learners, and 11.8% of our students with disabilities. So this kind of gives you an overview of our population that we serve. When you put Hawaii DOE's mission, vision, and core values together, this kind of gives you a picture of what we ultimately want to anchor our work to. And you'll see in those bubbles in the middle, whole child comes out right in front there. Social emotional well-being, being healthy, and students' needs being met. Students having joyful, lifelong learning experiences where they can reach their aspirations at their fullest potential. So how do we engage all of this in the context of the department? One of the many initiatives that we are implementing is the Hawaii Multitiered System of Support. That has been in place for many years, but we are refocusing and regrounding our efforts around this system. So related to the Hawaii Multi-Tiered System of Supports, we have 4 driving components. One is foundational beliefs, establishing and truly going back to what it is we believe as a school community, complex area, or a department. The other is having that data-driven, team-based decision-making approach so that we may make sound choices based on the right information for our students. And thus we need universal screening and progress monitoring so that we know our students. And based on what we know and the decision-making processes that we have, we then must implement a multi-tiered system of evidence-based practices so that we can coordinate our resources to meet the needs of all of our students. So we have 4 driving components that our schools focus on. So as we move forward with our more robust multi-tiered system of support than we've had in the past, we've worked on academics. We've also touched upon behavior with our schools, but we're now expanding to include social-emotional learning and the physical health and well-being of our students so that we have a holistic and more comprehensive view of everyone. And moving forward this coming school year, with 100% of our students returning to school and a new interim superintendent, our focus is going to be on 3-1-1, which perfectly aligns to this practice. So 3 being a focus for students on academics, attendance, and social-emotional learning. The 1 is on staff well-being, and the other 1 will be on safe returns and positive learning environments. So honing more in on this social emotional learning domain of the multi-tiered system of support, there are 3 areas that we focus on. One is identifying the knowledge, skills, and mindsets of our students. So that is going back to what was mentioned earlier about having that vision of what you want for the students and having the SEL goals in mind of what you want as outcomes for our kids. So not only having the knowledge, skills, and mindsets, but adding the supportive environment that was mentioned earlier, and being mindful of the programs and practices that align to those knowledge, skills, and mindsets that we want to address. So how does that work within the multi-tiered system of support? So here's some examples of what it could look like. So in tier 1, we then would have the schools identify their own social emotional learning, knowledge, competencies, skills, and mindsets as it relates to their school community and the context of their environment. We also want to encourage the inclusion of an explicit instruction practice, whether that be a program or agreed upon practices across the school, which could include the integration of SEL with academic and behavior practices so that it's authentic and meaningful in connection with each other and the students. We also have another initiative that's related to social emotional learning, which is trauma-informed and resilience practices, which will be critical as we return this school year, and building that culture of responsiveness and support so that we're not re-traumatizing our students. So that's all in best practice, tier 1. So what might that look like then for tier 2? So we know that tier 2 is supplemental to tier 1 and could include individual or small group instruction for students that need supplemental supports in SEL skills and mindsets from tier 1. And that could include circle-based groups, for example, that address those targeted needs. We also know that we'll have a range of students, and some students will need that intensive support and individualized needs. So in this case, we want to ensure that there are wraparound services to support our students, and that's where some of our trauma-informed practices might come into play. So taking a deeper look at the assessment component, we want to ensure that students are being identified and supported. So this diagram helps us look at the flow that schools might take to address that holistic student needs. So you'll see in the green below, on the left are the best practices that might be implemented in the school. And on the right, it's like Chris, I guess you're saying, take those bricks and know how it's built together to address that whole child. And we might be looking at attendance data. What is available to us regarding behavior such as discipline, as it was mentioned before, and social emotional learning and academics? Do we have that whole view of that student so that we can make informed decisions? We are in this coming school year working on adding in some mental health questions to address student needs in tier 2 and for tier 3 supports. So this kind of gives more of a view of what that identification and progress monitoring might look like. What we are also going to be implementing this school year, and this kind of also shows the journey that we've been in regards to social emotional learning data. So we are working, and we have been working on achieving more student voice, utilizing a student perception survey. And that has been collected for years now through various modes where we're addressing school climate overall. not necessarily individual student needs, but the overall climate and culture of our schools. That has been collected for some time now. What we are adding on and what has been included this past school year, because we've been in a remote learning environment, we've added in student and family voice and stakeholder surveys. So we've reached out to families, students, and even educators themselves asking, how's it going? What is your ability to connect with your school? What are your needs? What might you want us to do for you and your students? So that is also available now in addition to the climate survey data that we have. We had approximately, and it's growing in numbers, so we started with a small pilot of schools that were implementing a social-emotional learning student survey that would be implemented between the climate survey data points. And it's grown now to over 100 schools. And now this coming school year, we will be implementing this statewide. It is a formative perception data that really looks at students' perception of their competencies and how to address those or how they're feeling related to their competencies. So that's something that now is going to be scaled up across the state. As part of this practice, we know that we'd like to offer support to our schools and our teachers. So what's included as part of this survey is a link to professional development and activities and strategies related to social-emotional learning. So should a student identify with needs, for example, in belonging, they would be able to access this playbook, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. What's also included as part of the school initiative is a student voice and well-being check-in. So we want to be able to check in with the students and progress monitor. And we know that check-in and check-out is such a critical component to the strategies that we want to implement and support students. So while we are now assessing, and we have lots of data to address student needs, then what do we do with it? So this kind of gives us a high overview of how social-emotional learning data can support systems and adult practices, and how it connects to our tiered framework overall. So if we know what students think about their SEL strengths, how can then we systematize it within the multi-tiered system? So some of the survey topics that are addressed within our survey include a sense of belonging, self-management, social awareness, grit, growth mindset, self-efficacy, and emotion regulation. And how this helps us is it provides us with common understanding and meanings of what we want to achieve for our students overall. So having this data available then could then help us when we drive student supports from a universal perspective and school-wide practices. So for example, if we understand what students are telling us, and here's an example of one of the survey questions, during the past 30 days, how clearly were you able to describe your feelings? And in this case, 51% of our students felt favorable, that they would be able to describe their feelings. So what does this mean to us? That almost half of us would benefit from support. So that's what the students are saying. Some of us would benefit from the support finding the language to describe how we feel, for example. And what might that mean for a school system? Well, we might want our teachers across the board to do more check-ins, we might have pockets of success. How can we systematize that across our school system? And what are some practices such as marked brackets, ruler, mood meter that might help address these specific needs? And what other professional developments could we implement, such as restorative practices, to address our kids? So how this data can then describe or support systemic changes is basically what that shared. So how can we use the SEL data to drive group supports? So all schools receive a dashboard that provides them with an early warning approach with using the red, yellow, and green traffic lights. So we might then be able to look at the students that are in the yellow and identify those skill groups that I mentioned earlier, having those circled support groups of students and addressing specific areas of need. So in this case, maybe self-efficacy might be addressed here and benefit from having supplemental groups for our students. So then taking a look at those highest needs of students in terms of tier 3, what's provided to our schools is specific practices utilizing the playbook that might be recommended to address individualized student needs as well as groups, and that we might want to utilize and engage that check-in that was mentioned earlier for individual students as well, keeping a pulse and progress monitoring on those kids. So that's kind of everything in a nutshell of a high overview of what we're implementing and our journey, and more to be done as we move into this next school year to provide additional support and professional development and practices across the schools.
Thank you so much, Fern. We do have a question from Lynette. She was wondering how is your state planning on collecting the data? How do you house it and organize it? And then assuming also, how do you share it then with the schools?
So the data goes directly to the schools on a dashboard. So how schools have been doing this past school year is either by email. So particularly the schools who are doing remote learning, the emails went straight to the students and the students then completed the surveys. That data returned right back to the schools. Other schools found that time, particularly the in-person schools, found the time to do the surveys in class, and it goes directly to their dashboard. And what I showed you related to that early warning component. So they're able to see each individual question and as a group at large. Districts are able to see their schools data as well. And from the state, we're able to see a higher overview on the general makeup and pulse of our schools. So for example, we might all be able to see sense of belonging has been a challenge for us. How will we address that?
So the dashboard itself is created by the state, and then each school or district has access to that dashboard for their own results?
In this case, we are working with Panorama, and Panorama has a dashboard that's provided for us. So everyone has access to that. Also included on that dashboard is the climate survey that has been implemented every year. The family, student, and teacher surveys are also there as well.
Thanks. And Fern, a question I had is how are you seeing schools using the assessment data? Is it individual teachers, or is it school teams, or is it specialists who are looking at, or is it a combination of that, who are making the decisions on how to address what they're seeing on their dashboards?
So I'll give you an example of how some of our schools are implementing this. So some schools, and we encourage this, that they would have school-wide teams coming together, whether it's an MTSS team or a leadership team, that they're looking at the broad strokes of their whole school needs. So they're looking at that data overall, which might include the school counselor. And in some of our schools, that is the case, where they're looking at the data from a system perspective. And they have identified, perhaps, like I mentioned earlier, belonging as a need. So as a school-wide system team, they're now implementing lessons and activities that would address that sense of belonging. And at the same time, the counselor team might be looking at those individual needs that are identified as red or at risk, and touching bases with those students individually or small groups.
Okay. Fern, thank you so much. And Chris and Katie, also thank you. At this time, we would like to gather some feedback from everyone who has participated. So as you see in the chat box, Kirsten has posted a link to our very brief 5-question survey that will ask you a few questions about today's session. Please go ahead and click on that link to take the survey now, or if you'd like to wait until the post-webinar email, that email will also have the survey link. That gives us a little bit of feedback for us on helping to create future presentations that we will be presenting. And I'll give you a reminder that we will have a 3rd session on this topic coming up, which we're currently planning for now. And we'll be sending out more information on that session to you all, and a registration link in the coming days or in the next couple of weeks. Chris, Katie, Fern, thank you all so much for lending your time and your insights and your expertise today. We really do appreciate it. If any of our participants would like to connect with you, we are showing your email contact information on the screen today. So please do, participants, please do feel free to reach out to our 3 presenters if you think of questions later, or want to get a few more resources to think about your own school or systems approach to SEL and balanced assessment systems. So again, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate you spending some time with us today. We are going to draw today's session to a close. So again, thank you, and have a terrific rest of your day.